Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Wendy Williams, and this is the beginning of Unit 5, and this time we're going to be talking about stimulus control, the ability of stimuli to control our behavior by signaling to us whether a reinforcer is going to be available if we behave a certain way, or if a punisher is going to be available, or if nothing will happen. So I have lots of examples here of stimuli in our environment that prompt us to engage in certain behaviors, whether it's street lights and walk signs and don't walk signs, or the buttons in an elevator that prompt us what to do, whether it's getting into the express line at the grocery store with your 15 items or less. I hate it when people get in that line and they have more than they're supposed to. Knowing when to park or not to park. If there's a handicap sticker, those shoes tell me that I need to do some laundry because those shoes need to be washed. So the presence of rain tells you need to put up an umbrella. So relying on cues from our environment to prompt us to engage in behaviors that are likely to produce reinforcers or other specific consequences. Control generally refers to our ability to rely on environmental cues to prompt or gain control over our behavior. So what kinds of things control your behavior? What controls your behavior when you're behind the wheel? Sometimes these things are not very obvious. What controls your behavior at the ATM? I want to show you a couple of clips really quickly to see what it is that is controlling your behavior, or what would be controlling your behavior. I want you to imagine yourself in a car and pay attention to the things that control your behavior. If you were driving, what would you do, and what kinds of things are controlling your behavior? Let's let it go here. So, are you noticing the cars that are going by you? Are you paying attention to the car in front of you? Are you looking at lights that are coming on? These are all things that serve as cues in our environment to allow us to function in very busy traffic. Getting money out of the ATM. What are the cues that control your behavior? Let me show you here with no sound. Oops. There we go. All right. There he goes. Sorry about that. I need to be a little slow. What are the cues? All kinds of prompts. So, doing the things that you need to do in order, and the cues that are on the ATM that prompt you what behavior you should do next. So again, we're learning to rely on stimuli in the environment and responding to the stimuli differently. Look at all the buttons that there are on this ATM and using the stimuli that are present to help you find which options you want to use. So up until now, we've been talking about the ABCs of behavior, the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences. And we have been focusing a lot on behavior and its consequences in the last few units. And in the stimulus control unit, discrimination and generalization, we're really talking about the antecedents, the things that come before we behave, the cues in our environment, the signals in our environment that tell us whether or not a reinforcer is available for certain behaviors. And we come to depend on our surroundings to prompt us to use the proper behaviors. So there are three types of stimulus control. There are what we call discriminative stimuli for reinforcement, discriminative stimuli for extinction, and discriminative stimuli for punishment. And we'll talk about each one of these. Now, when we refer to discriminative stimuli, it's abbreviated SD. there's a whole story behind why that is and why it's not DS. It used to be that the D was a tiny little superscript, but it slowly made itself because of word processing and our ability to desktop publish. The SD is now, they're both the same size for simplicity reasons. So a stimulus that is discriminatory in nature really means that it's a stimulus that carries important information about certain behaviors, and their likelihood of being reinforced. Some stimuli tell us that certain behaviors are going to produce reinforcers, like being in class and raising your hand for an answer means you have a chance to respond, and you will probably get a reinforcer for volunteering an answer. And these SDs create something that we call behavioral excitation. It makes us want to do something. When you know the right answer, you want to put your hand up. When the phone rings, you want to answer it. If you get a text message, that ding that tells you that you have a text waiting for you. Someone who says, who knows the answer? If you do, you're going to raise your hand. So those cues, the ringing phone, the ding of your text message, or the teacher saying, who knows the answer, are all cues for you to behave in a certain way so that you can get a reinforcer. Okay, so S delta, which is the symbol here, where we have the S and that little triangle. That little triangle is the Greek symbol delta, and it basically is a discriminative stimulus for extinction. The S delta is the abbreviation for stimuli that tell us that our behavior is not going to be reinforced, even though we think that it would. So closed signs. So for example, you might be going to your favorite store and you get excited that you're going to get to go and buy something that you really like, and you get there and you see, sorry, we're closed. You lose that excitation to behave. You don't get out of your car and you don't go to the door and push on the door to try and go in, because you've just received a signal that says that those behaviors will not be reinforced by allowing you into the store. So out of order signs on pop machines or snack machines tell you that you can put your money in, but you're not going to get what you want. Locked door handles tell you that you're not going to be able to get into the next room. Busy signals that tell you the person won't be answering the phone. All of those can serve as what we call S delta stimuli because they signal extinction, the absence of reinforcement. Now, there's a third cue called an SP. And this is the cue for impending punishment. These are cues that tell us that certain behaviors are very likely to be punished. They might produce conditioned inhibition, or it might produce fear, conditioned fear, like being in the library with a librarian who is likely to, if you talk very loud, is going to shush you or ask you to leave. Signs on men and women's bathrooms. So that you go into one but you don't go in the other, because if you go in the other, somebody's going to scream and get very upset, and that would be punishing. Those signs on the highway when you're driving that says speed check by radar. Okay, that's a warning that if you continue the behavior, you may get punished with a ticket. Things like beware of dog signs. Just kidding. So just imagine how hard it would be if we couldn't learn to rely on cues in the environment to tell us which behaviors will be reinforced, which ones, although usually are reinforced, are not working right now, and those behaviors that tell us that punishment could happen if we continue in a particular, with a particular behavior. So, stimulus discrimination is really the ability to behave differently in the presence of different stimuli. So, the game red light, green light tells you what you can do. We learn to behave differently in the presence of SD, discriminative stimuli, S deltas, those signals that tell us that our behavior will be met with extinction, and SPs, where our behavior will be met with punishment. Now, stimulus generalization is where we're able to respond to a new and novel stimulus because it resembles one that you already know. And so this is where we take cues that we've learned about, and when we see new versions of them, we're able to engage in the appropriate behavior. So you've learned how to drive, so you can drive pretty much anywhere. So if you learn to drive in Washington, you can probably go to New York, and you'll be fine if you drive in New York, because everything's about the same. But when I moved to New Zealand, everything was wrong. They drive on the wrong side of the road. They drive on the wrong side of the car. And so all of those cues related to cars prompted me to do behaviors that were wrong. I remember when I first landed, I went out to hail a taxi, and while the taxi driver was putting my bags in his trunk, I walked around to the front, to the side, the right-hand side of the car, because I wanted to get in as a passenger. And as he came around the corner, he said, "Oh, you want to drive?" And I was like, "No," because that's where the driver sits. That's not the passenger seat. It was very odd. So, as long as the stimuli are similar, we're fine. So if you go and rent a car in New York, chances are the car will be similar to one that you might have rented in Seattle, and you'll be able to drive it. I never got behind the wheel of a car when I was in New Zealand because everything, the steering wheel's in the wrong place, all the pedals on the floor are in the wrong place. It's just all very, very weird. So I didn't do that. Let me back up. So in New York City, I see a car and it signals to me that I can get into the car and I can drive the car, and so I get my reinforcers. But when I was in New Zealand, cars signaled extinction or even possibly punishment. I didn't want to run anybody over. And so for that reason, the same general stimulus, a car, can serve as an S plus or an SD or an S delta for the same person. So it was very scary. I didn't like it. And so stimulus generalization, as we start to recognize that all those different vehicles on the road are all cars, we form something that we call a response class. And it's where we, although they look a little different, we kind of lump them into a bigger class. And so cars are a class of stimuli that affect our behavior similarly. Telephones are a class of stimuli that affect us similarly. If a phone is sitting on the table and it rings and there's nobody around, we'll probably answer it. Forks. Just because a fork has 4 tongs or 3 tongs doesn't suddenly mean that we can't use them. We're able to make that leap from a 4-tong fork to a 3-tong fork without too much trouble. Being able to recognize a dog, whether it's a Great Dane or a St. Bernard, or whether it's a Chihuahua or a Pomeranian, we have learned through our lives the category of dogs. Pencils, knowing that you can use a mechanical pencil or a colored pencil or a number 2 pencil, they're all pencils. So this is what we call a response class. The stimuli in that class produce the same behavior. Chairs, we don't have to recognize, we don't necessarily discriminate between types of chairs when we're looking for a place to sit down. We see a chair, we go and we sit. So it's pretty straightforward. So here's an example. I want to give you an example of how a stimulus can change and yet we still know what to do. So here's an example of some stimuli, and they're very different from the ones that we're familiar with. And yet, I suspect that no matter where you are in the world, if you saw one of these signs, you probably would do the same thing. All of us would probably stop. Why? Because there's enough similarity between all of these different stop signs that even though the wording is different, the fact that they're the right shape, they're on a pole near a corner, all of those pieces come together to say this is part of a response class and I'm going to respond to this stimulus the way I know how when I see one in my country that says stop. So although I might have trouble with the languages around the outside. I do speak Spanish, and so in the center it says alto, and it means stop. So all of these mean stop, and you would probably put your foot on the brake and bring your car to a stop, even if you don't read the language. Now, what do we do if the sign is unfamiliar? This is something that we call discrimination. If the sign itself is not recognizable, it might be a sign on the side of the road. It says something in a language, but it's not, there's nothing about it that's familiar. It's not a shape you recognize. It's not the words you can't read. So what if the sign is unfamiliar? Well, we treat it differently by either responding appropriately, we guess, or we usually will decide not to respond at all. So often we'll try to respond and we'll maybe make a mistake, or we might not respond whatsoever. Either way, we still treat the stimulus differently than we would if we knew exactly what it meant. So here are some examples of some signs that we don't often see. We may not know how to respond to them. So, these are the ones that we do respond to. So these are the ones that we look at and we treat them all differently. So these are signs that here in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got one-way signs and stop signs. And so we respond to each of these. Here's a no U-turn sign, a wrong way. Here's a yield sign. The one in the center is a sign that many of you probably haven't seen, but because I grew up in California near the border, this is a sign that warns you that there could be people running on the highway. And so when you're close to the border, people get across the border and then they're trying to find their way into the city, and they might run across highways. So you have to watch out for them so that you don't hit them. So those are signs that we would recognize and we would know how to behave most of the time. Now here are some signs that we probably don't recognize, and you might be left like me. I'm like speechless. I don't even know what to do. So here are some signs. They're in different languages, and it's confusing and it's hard to figure out what they are. So there's the one in the center. If you look really close, you might be able to guess what it is. And because it's in Spanish, you might recognize some of the letters. So the first, ruta de evacuación, it kind of looks like an evacuation route, and there's a volcano. So the fact that we're able to, this is a volcano evacuation route. And so that's something that would be, we might have to decipher it, and because the words are a little bit familiar, we might be able to behave appropriately. The other two, I have absolutely no idea what they are or what they mean. But the one on the right, it always makes me laugh, because anything that says that it deals with farts has got to be funny. I'm wondering if it might have something to do with speed bumps, but I don't know. And so here's an example of stimuli that we don't have, that don't fit into a response class, and we don't know how to respond to them. So how is it that we learn how to do this? How do some stimuli come to control our behavior and others don't? Well, under normal circumstances, stimulus control develops gradually within our community, within our culture, within our experience. And it's usually a result of experience with a particular outcome when that stimulus is present. So you have that stimulus present, and we behave in a certain way, and then we get real consequences. And that can be very useful. There are lots and lots of examples in the world. Knowing what to do with a bottle of pop. Knowing how to, when to take notes and when not to take notes. So when you're in a classroom and there's a professor and there's a PowerPoint presentation going on up on the screen, you take notes. But when you're in the movie theater and there's a screen and there's stuff going on, you don't take notes. Because in one case, it produces something good for you. Taking notes results in better grades. And in the other case, that's not such a big thing. So there are lots of examples in our world. Knowing how to, the table manners for fancy restaurants is something that people who eat in fancy restaurants learn how to do. Knowing what to do with a finger bowl, knowing, what a, lobster or a, escargot fork is for and how to use it. All these are things I don't know very much about. But lots and lots of cues in your environment. Think about when you went to school the last time, when you walked or drove. Do you remember where you stopped and stopped at stop signs or waited for traffic? Or are you kind of guessing based on lots of experience you actually remember? Many times the cues that prompt our behavior become so automatic that we don't even think about them. So you see them in the real world. You see them, we study them. We see them and study them in the laboratory. And you can even use them in therapeutic settings, using prompts and cues to get clients to respond in certain ways to earn reinforcers. So one of the things that comes up in a therapeutic environment when you're working with clients are those individuals who need to be taught certain kinds of discriminations, how to respond differently to different stimuli. So training discriminations is something that comes up when you're working with individuals. In my experience, it's working with individuals with disabilities, but it's also true that you might be working with children, and helping them to learn how to behave appropriately so that they, for example, don't hurt themselves. Here's the picture's an example of, these are little sleeves that you can put over hot and cold faucets so that the individuals have the cues are more noticeable and more salient. And so they learn that blue on the right with a C on it goes with cold, and red on the left with H on it goes for hot. Here, the SD, the discriminative stimulus, and the S delta are present at the same time. So simultaneous discriminations are one of the best ways to teach someone how to discriminate between two very different objects, in this case, the hot faucet and the cold faucet, when it's a difficult discrimination. These two things are very close together, and it would be very easy to make the mistake and turn the wrong nozzle and get burned. And so we want them to learn to see them side by side. It allows for direct comparison, and the consequences are clear. When you turn on the hot water, the water that comes out gets hot. And when you turn on the cold water, it doesn't get so hot. So this is a very good way to train certain behaviors because the items occur simultaneously. And later, if you need to, we can rely on simultaneous discrimination training. Even for really difficult discriminations for items that come up separately, we can put the items together and have them learn them side by side in a simultaneous discrimination like this one. And then we can shift to more successive training. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this faucet is one example of how you could do a simultaneous discrimination training session where the two objects that they need to learn about are present at the same time. Here is here are some other examples of simultaneous discriminations where things are apparent at the same time. So in the upper right-hand corner, we have a fork and a knife and a spoon. Now we could train them separately, but that would be a lot harder with a person with autism if you're trying to get them to learn which one is the fork, which one is the knife, and which one is the spoon. If you present them together, then you can train them together and tell them when they're correct and correct them when they're incorrect. An example that's more from our experience, from a typically developing individual's experience is the bottom right, where you're learning which pedals do what on the car. They're available simultaneously, and you slowly master the differences between them until now most of us, I don't know if all of you drive a stick, most of you, some of you may only know about two pedals, the brake and the accelerator. But for those of you who've ever driven a stick, my first car was a Volkswagen. And so I know about the clutch and I know how to use a clutch. So, but those of you who haven't done it would have to do some discrimination training with it present and how to use it so that you could respond correctly. And trust me, when you're using a clutch, there are definite punishers when you put when you try to put the car in gear and you don't push the clutch in, it makes a terrible noise. So you would get that as a punisher. On the left, what I have is an example of training labels for items. So if you're working with individuals, whether these are small children or people with disabilities who are learning either to say particular words for each item or to point to identify certain items, here they're all available simultaneously. And it might be a lot harder if you held up a coffee pot or a teapot and said, "What is this?" than it would be to say, point to the teapot and see that they get it right. So this might be the early training and here everything's available simultaneously, and that makes it a lot easier. And if you hang on a second, I have an example of this method being used with some children. So hang on a second here. The video that I'm going to show you is an autism therapy video, and they're talking about discrimination teaching procedures. This is a simultaneous discrimination procedure where they're presenting items at the same time, but they present them randomly. So they randomly present several items and then ask the individual to pick the correct one. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
Discrimination procedure is called random rotation, which is presenting two or more targets in random order and/or in random position.
Give me both. Good job. Very nice, Ashley. Give me shoe. You did it. That was so great. All right, here we go. We gotta do nice sitting. Nice sitting. Good job. Give me car. You got it. That's the car.
In this example, the instructor targets ball on the first trial. The student gives the correct response. So the instructor rotates the positions of the materials and targets shoe on the second trial. Again, when the student gives the correct answer, the instructor rotates the positions and targets a different item, car, on the third trial.
If you go back, you'll be able to use the PowerPoint slides to tap into that random rotation applied behavior analysis video if you want to watch it again. Now, another form of training is what we call successive discriminations, and this is where the SD, the one that produces reinforcement, and the S delta, the one that does not produce reinforcement, are presented separately. They don't occur side by side next to each other. And while knowing the difference between a fork and a spoon and a knife is important, we often see them together. There are many times when the discriminations that we have to make have to occur when only one of the stimuli is present. So, for example, the street lights, knowing when which behavior is associated with which stimulus. So when the light is red, knowing that you're supposed to bring your car to a stop. When the light is green, knowing that you are supposed to accelerate and move forward. And when it turns yellow, knowing that you have to look for more cues. So are there people in front of you? Are you close enough to the intersection? Are you already in the intersection? Then you keep going. So it really depends. The difference between the walk and don't walk signs, you know, when we're talking about adults, these have become so automatic, we don't even think about them. But when you're talking about people with disabilities or people, children learning how to cross streets, these are really important cues, and they have to learn how to respond to each one of them appropriately. And this successive discrimination procedure, where items are presented one after the other, not together, is important, especially when the natural behavior requires stimulus control by only one of those stimuli. So we know that when the light is green or when the little man is walking, that we can walk across the street. But when it says don't walk, or when the light is red, that there could be a potential either extinction or punishment for trying to walk when you're not supposed to. And so when you're training these kinds of behaviors with these individuals, we might, for example, train how to cross the street in a classroom setting, and we will try to simulate the natural conditions under which that target behavior should occur and when it shouldn't occur. And so it may require some preliminary exposure using simultaneous discrimination. So I might be able to use a card like the walk, don't walk sign here. And I might be able to put that in front of a child and say, walk. And they would point to the walk sign, or don't walk, and they would point to the don't walk sign, because they can see them next to each other. And then later, I would use those signs up in a simulation and have them recognize and behave appropriately with each one. So hold up the walk sign and have them walk across the little simulated road, and then put up the don't walk sign and have them stop. So we might start with simultaneous side-by-side discrimination and move to successive discrimination where we train them separately. So here, I want to finish up quickly here. I have a slide that shows you some of those signs that we rely on, some of those cues that we rely on that are really presented successively and not simultaneously. So when we see a speed limit sign of 25, we don't get to see any other signs. That's just the one that we see, and we have to behave appropriately. No parking. There's not any other sign. The same with one-ways and stop signs. Come in, we're open versus sorry, we're closed. Typically, you don't see both of them. You only see one or the other. And the same is true for restroom signs. Typically, we don't see them side by side. We walk in and we see one of them, or we walk over and we see another one, but they're not right next to each other. So learning how to respond appropriately, that you go into one and that you don't go into the other. So I'm going to stop here. This has been a little bit of a long lecture because of the little film clips. So I'm going to stop, and we'll come back with a lecture for Chapter 7B, also on stimulus control. Okay, have a good day.